The laughter started before the lawyer finished the second paragraph. Ethan Miller stood near the back of the cramped office, his hands folded loosely in front of him, as if that might keep them from shaking. The room smelled faintly of old paper, burnt coffee, and winter coats damp from melting snow. Outside, December winds scraped against the windows, sharp and impatient, but inside the cold came from somewhere else entirely. Robert Miller leaned back in his chair, one ankle resting smugly over the opposite knee. Calvin sat beside him, lips curled in a grin he didn't bother to hide. They'd been waiting for this moment, Ethan could tell. Not the reading of their father's will, but his reaction to it. The lawyer cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. To Ethan Miller, he read, "The youngest son, I leave the northern hillside property, approximately 60 acres of undeveloped land. There it was. No farmhouse, no equipment, no savings, just land. And not even good land." Robert let out a low whistle. "That old rock hill?" he said, shaking his head. Dad really had a sense of humor. Calvin laughed openly this time. Guess he figured Ethan likes quiet places. No neighbors, no responsibilities. A few chuckles followed, from people who didn't know Ethan well enough to feel uncomfortable laughing at him. Ethan said nothing. He had learned a long time ago that arguing with people who had already made up their minds was a waste of breath. Still, something tight and heavy settled in his chest, pressing down slowly, the way disappointment always did when it arrived quietly. The lawyer continued reading, but Ethan barely heard the rest. His mind replayed memories instead, helping his father mend fences, hauling firewood, sitting at the kitchen table late at night while his brothers were out drinking, listening to his father talk about land as if it were alive. "Land doesn't owe you anything," his father used to say, "but if you pay attention, it'll tell you what it can give." Apparently no one else had been listening. When the reading ended, Robert clapped Calvin on the shoulder and stood. "Well," he said, looking straight at Ethan, "guess we know who Dad expected to actually do something with his share." The words stung more than Ethan expected. Not because they were cruel, but because they sounded final, like a verdict already passed. Ethan nodded once, polite, restrained. He signed the papers when they were slid in front of him, folded the deed carefully, and placed it inside his coat pocket like something fragile. No one stopped him when he picked up his jacket. No one asked if he was okay. As he stepped outside, the cold air hit his face hard, sharp enough to make his eyes water. Ethan paused on the sidewalk, breathing in, steadying himself. 60 acres of stone and silence. Most people would have seen it as a punishment. Ethan, standing there alone with snow beginning to fall, wasn't sure what he saw yet, but something in him refused to believe his father had meant it as a joke. And for the first time that day, beneath the weight of humiliation and loss, a quiet, stubborn resolve began to form. He didn't know what waited on that hillside, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to walk away from it. Ethan reached the hillside 3 days later, his boots worn thin and his shoulders aching from the weight of his pack. The road had ended miles back, giving way to a narrow trail that twisted upward through scrub oak and cedar. By the time he crossed the rusted survey marker that marked the edge of his land, the sky was already dimming, the winter light fading fast. The place was quieter than he expected. No birds, no distant farm sounds. Just wind moving through branches and the occasional clatter of loose stone underfoot. So this is it, he thought. 60 acres of rock, slope, and stubborn ground that didn't seem interested in being claimed. He walked until his legs trembled, scouting for anything that looked like shelter. There was no flat clearing, no obvious place to build. The land rose and fell in uneven ridges, limestone pushing up through thin soil like bone through skin. It wasn't hostile exactly, but it wasn't welcoming either. By nightfall, the cold settled in deep. Ethan built a small fire beneath a shallow rock overhang, ate the last of his bread and jerky, and wrapped himself in his coat. Sleep came in fragments. Each sound, the snap of a branch, the low howl of wind, pulled him halfway back to wakefulness. Morning brought frost and a sharp ache in his hands. He spent the next 2 days exploring, moving slowly, deliberately. Ethan had learned during harder years that rushing only wasted energy. He followed natural lines in the land, depressions, clusters of moss, places where air seemed to move differently. That was when he noticed it. A faint breath of warmth. At first he thought it was his imagination, but the closer he moved toward the base of a limestone outcrop, the clearer it became. The air near one section of rock didn't bite the way the rest of the hillside did. It hovered there, almost gentle. Ethan pushed aside tangled vines and found a narrow opening. The entrance was small, barely tall enough to crouch through, but inside the space widened. The temperature changed almost immediately. Not warm like a fire, but steady, calm, the kind of warmth that sank into muscle and bone. He stood there longer than he meant to, breathing slowly, his guarded mind struggling to catch up with what his body already understood. This place could keep him alive. He returned to the cave before dark and claimed it without ceremony. There was no triumph, no sudden joy, just relief mixed with cautious hope. Over the next weeks, Ethan settled into a rhythm that was simple and unforgiving. He hauled water, scavenged fallen wood, learned where the sun touched the ground longest. He made careful trips into the nearest town, ignoring the stares and half-spoken rumors. "Man living in a hole," someone muttered once, loud enough for him to hear. Ethan didn't respond. Loneliness crept in during the quiet hours. At night, sitting just inside the cave mouth, he felt the weight of distance, from his family, from warmth that came from people instead of stone. Doubt followed close behind. What if they were right? But every morning the cave greeted him the same way. Stable, patient, unchanging. The deeper he moved inside, the warmer it became. He noticed moisture on the walls, a faint trickle of water farther in. He marked it in his notebook, the way he'd been taught to observe rather than assume. Something was happening beneath the rock, and for the first time since the reading of the will, Ethan felt something stronger than humiliation or fear. He felt curious. Whatever his brothers had laughed at, whatever they thought they'd taken from him, hadn't followed him up the hill. This land was speaking, and Ethan was finally listening. Ethan followed the sound before he trusted his eyes. It was faint at first, a soft, irregular whisper beneath the steady quiet of the cave. He stood still, breath held, letting the noise separate itself from the drip of condensation and the shuffle of his own boots. The sound wasn't cold. It carried a warmth that felt wrong for midwinter. He moved deeper. The cave sloped downward in a way he hadn't noticed before, the air growing thicker, gentler. His breath stopped fogging. The ache in his fingers eased. When he reached a wider chamber, the temperature surprised him enough that he took off his gloves without thinking. Then he saw it. A shallow pool stretched across the far end of the chamber, its surface smooth and dark, reflecting the dim lantern light. Steam lifted from it in slow, lazy curls. Ethan crouched and dipped his fingers in. Warm, almost hot. He pulled his hand back, heart pounding. Not from fear, but from sudden understanding. This wasn't luck. This was geology. Heat rising from deep underground, trapped and guided by stone older than memory. For a long moment, Ethan just sat there on a flat rock, staring at the water as if it might vanish if he blinked. His mind, usually cautious and restrained, raced ahead. This changes everything. The days that followed were the most focused he had ever known. Ethan became methodical, almost scholarly in his routine. He marked temperatures at different points in the cave, noted how the air moved, how steam gathered and drifted. He carved shallow channels in the stone to guide the water away from the pool, letting it cool naturally as it traveled. The cave wasn't just shelter anymore. It was a system. As winter deepened outside, the cave remained steady. While nearby farms burned through firewood, Ethan relied on stone and patience. Word began to spread, quietly at first. People expected him to disappear, then to fail. When he didn't, curiosity replaced mockery. A local surveyor stopped by one afternoon, pretending to check property lines. He left shaken, eyes wide. "Didn't think it was possible," he said. "Living like this?" Neither had Ethan, at least not until the cave taught him otherwise. The real turning point came with the arrival of Daniel Harper, a regional geologist passing through on contract work. He listened more than he spoke, asked careful questions, and insisted on seeing the water source himself. "This," Daniel said slowly, standing in the warm chamber, "isn't just a spring. It's a geothermal pocket. Rare around here. Valuable." The words settled between them. Valuable. Ethan didn't feel triumphant. He felt grounded, vindicated, not in a loud way, but in the quiet sense that comes when effort meets truth. The land his brothers had laughed at wasn't empty. It was misunderstood. Daniel left with notes and promises to return. Ethan stayed behind, sitting beside the pool long after the lantern burned low. He thought about the office where he'd been dismissed, the laughter that had followed him out the door. For the first time, it didn't hurt, because beneath that laughter had been something real, something patient, waiting to be found. The cave hadn't given him comfort out of kindness. It had rewarded attention. Ethan stood and looked around the chamber, the stone walls glowing faintly, the steam rising in slow breath-like waves. This place wasn't a hiding spot. It was a beginning. And as winter raged above, Ethan Miller understood something essential. He hadn't inherited a mistake. He had inherited time, heat, and possibility, and he was finally ready to use them. Grace Turner arrived on a gray afternoon, carried more than she walked. Her brother eased her down from the wagon with the careful patience of someone who had already said goodbye once and wasn't ready to say it again. Grace was thin, her breathing shallow and uneven, her face drawn tight by exhaustion that sleep no longer fixed. She looked around the hillside with a polite, distant calm, the kind people wear when they don't expect much. "This is it?" she asked softly. Ethan nodded. He didn't offer promises. He never had. Inside the cave, the change was immediate. Grace's shoulders dropped as the cold released its grip. The warmth didn't rush at her. It waited. She closed her eyes, inhaled slowly, and for the first time in months, didn't cough. Ethan watched without comment, observant and restrained. He had learned not to mistake relief for recovery. Still, something eased in his chest. Grace stayed the night, then another. Days settled into weeks. The routine was simple and steady. Warm baths drawn carefully from the spring, quiet meals, long hours of rest. Ethan moved around her with an unspoken gentleness, mindful without hovering. He talked when she asked questions. He listened when she spoke, which wasn't often at first. The cave changed with her presence. Ethan widened passages, leveled stone floors, built a small sleeping platform near the outer chamber, where air stayed fresh. He adjusted water channels so the temperature could be controlled. These were practical acts, but they carried something else too: intention. Grace noticed. "You built this to last," she said one evening, watching steam rise from the pool. "Most people just build to get by." Ethan shrugged. Stone remembers shortcuts. Her laugh surprised them both. It was soft, unguarded, and it lingered. Grace didn't recover in a dramatic way. There was no sudden miracle. What happened was quieter, slower. Her breathing grew easier. Her strength returned in careful increments. She began walking the cave on her own, then helping with small tasks, organizing supplies, writing letters for Ethan, keeping records he never thought to keep. They talked late into the evenings, voices low, the cave walls holding their words. Grace spoke about the life she'd put on pause. Ethan spoke about a family he no longer felt the need to prove himself to. For the first time, the cave was more than shelter. Others came after Grace. Word travels faster than doubt ever does. A man with a ruined knee, a woman worn thin by grief. Ethan never turned anyone away outright. He charged what people could afford and nothing when they couldn't. He didn't call it healing. He called it warmth and time. Grace became the bridge between Ethan and the outside world. She greeted guests. She set boundaries. She reminded Ethan to eat, to rest, to let others help. The cave filled with quiet human sounds, conversation, careful laughter, the soft rhythm of lives easing back into themselves. One night, after the others had gone to sleep, Grace took Ethan's hand. "You didn't just survive here," she said. "You made room." Ethan didn't pull away. He didn't rush forward either. He had learned the value of patience, from stone, from water, from pain that needed time more than force. Outside, winter loosened its hold. Inside, something lasting had already taken root. The cave, once a refuge for one man, had become a place where broken things didn't have to pretend they weren't broken. And Ethan Miller, who had come here alone, understood that what he was building now wasn't just a life. It was a purpose. Years passed the way seasons do, slowly, then all at once. The hillside that once felt abandoned began to feel settled. Not busy, not loud, but lived in. People came and went quietly, carrying aches, grief, or exhaustion they didn't know how to set down anywhere else. The cave offered them what it had always offered Ethan: steady warmth, patience, and time. Grace never claimed to be cured. She didn't need to. She lived better, breathed easier, laughed more. She became the heart of the place in ways Ethan never tried to be. Together, they built routines that felt honest. No grand signs, No promises carved into stone, just care, repeated daily. Ethan heard news of his brothers eventually. Robert lost the farmland after a string of bad seasons and worse decisions. Calvin's business collapsed under debt he pretended wasn't there until it swallowed him whole. Neither ever visited the hillside. Neither ever asked to see what Ethan had done with the land they'd laughed at. Ethan didn't feel victorious. He felt clear. The cave taught him that success didn't need an audience. It only needed integrity. Stone didn't care who doubted you. Water didn't care who mocked you. They responded only to attention and effort. When Ethan grew older, the work grew quieter. He taught others what he had learned: how to listen to land, how to build without forcing, how to recognize value before the world agreed it existed. The cave remained what it had always been: grounded, enduring, unchanged by trends or praise. On his last winter, Ethan sat beside the spring, steam rising gently around him. Grace's hand rested in his, warm and steady. The sound of water echoed softly, the same rhythm that had welcomed him years ago, when he arrived with nothing but doubt and determination. He smiled not because everything had been easy, but because it had been honest. Ethan Miller never became famous. He never reclaimed the approval of people who hadn't believed in him. But he built something that lasted, something useful, something human. In the end, the land he inherited hadn't been a joke or a punishment. It had been an invitation to look deeper, to listen longer, to build differently. And maybe that was the real inheritance. Not property, not money, but the chance to decide who you become when no one expects anything from you. Questions for you. If you were given something everyone else thought was worthless, what would you do with it? Do you think success is about proving others wrong or proving yourself right? Have you ever found value in a place or moment others overlooked? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. We read everyone. If stories like this move you, inspire you, or make you see the world a little differently, subscribe to the channel and stay with us. More stories are waiting, quiet ones, powerful ones, and the kind that linger long after they're told. Because sometimes the greatest legacy isn't what we're given. It's what we choose to build.